Howdy, and welcome to the Deep Space Travel Network, your home for, well, pretty much everything No Man's Sky, hopefully. So today, I'm here to do a video about every single No Man's Sky update since release, all the major ones. We're going to be reviewing them, we're going to be scoring them, and we're going to be ranking them. This is a piece of content I've always wanted to see on YouTube, just a comprehensive look at everything Hello Games has produced. Bear in mind, I won't be covering some of the smaller named patches, such as Byte Beat or Crossplay. They will be included, like I will talk about them, but I won't be ranking them against the larger updates, because I feel like, first of all, they weren't given the same attention as the larger updates. They weren't intended to be these huge tentpole updates, and comparing them feature-wise, they often had really cool features, but it was very limited in scope compared to like the big titled updates. Even the small titled updates had significantly more patch notes. So just keep that in mind. So I'm recording this as I'm waiting for Frontiers to drop. I have no idea what's going to be in that update, but I figured to celebrate 5 years of incredible updates, now would be the time to record this. So a little bit of background. I'm a day one player. I picked it up August 9th, 2016, played it on my PS4, and I logged in for every update since then. I played for a couple months at launch, put it away for a bit, played it at Foundations, and I would say Pathfinder is when I really got absolutely hooked. But I have fond memories of every update, and I would love to go through this chronologically, right? So if you're a new player, this might be your first time hearing about when all these new features were added, and I think it gives a lot of great context for just where the game was at launch, and every year, you know, where it was. Stuff that we can't live without today, like the quick menu. You know, that wasn't even added until after launch, and that's the kind of stuff that I really hope to highlight. So, how am I going to do this? Obviously, my opinion is going to be very skewed because I enjoy the game. So I figure I'm going to do two sets of rankings. The first rank is going to be based on a score, and that score is going to be based on 8 criteria. The 4 pillars the game was advertised with, as well as 4 additional pillars that I think are pivotal to the No Man's Sky experience. I'm going to rate those based on a scale of 0 to 10. Average those out, and the final average will be that update's score. And then based on that score, I will rank them, right? And that's somewhat objective, right? It's not perfect, but it should give you a somewhat quantified view of just how these updates stack up against each other. Now, I'm going to do a second ranking alongside that, and that's going to be my very subjective ranking. You know, it's going to be a ranking based on how much the update made me smile, because every update makes me smile. So that will be very subjective. And then at the end of all this, it's going to be a multi-video series most likely. At the end of all this, I will be doing a tier list where I'm going to be ranking them, you know, A tier, B tier, S tier, maybe F tier. I mean, we'll see, right? And that'll be a whole separate video. But this series is going to be reviewing them in some detail. I'm not going to cover every patch note because God only knows how long that would take. But I will be covering the major improvements and new features added in each update, so that you can follow along this series and learn pretty much the complete history of the post-release development of this game. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started with the first and often most overlooked game-changing update, and that would be the Day 1 patch, which some of you might say, well, that kind of breaks your first rule of not listing small, unnamed updates. Yes, that does, but I think it's a very good sort of base, right? It's a good standard to compare everything else against. It did include a universe reset and a lot of other features, and I think it's a good place to start to give context to where the game was at launch, which, funny enough, was not version 1.0. but version 1.03. Alright, so the day 1 patch, version 1.03, released August 9th, 2016. Notable features included a universe reset with new biomes and weather types, a new storyline with branching paths, improvements to inventory, as well as gameplay and other systems, and a whole bunch of stuff, right? So the screenshot I have here is just the first screenshot I ever took, day 1, right? Patch installed. They didn't have an official cover for this one. But let me go down the patch notes and see what they wrote. The major stuff. So we have the 3 paths, which are 3 unique paths you can follow throughout the game. They reset the universe. They changed terrain, generation, biomes, all kinds of stuff like that, which was pretty big. Diversity, it says creatures are now more diverse in terms of ecology and densities on planets. Planets themselves, they added dead moons, low atmosphere, and extreme hazard planets. So apparently this patch added blizzards and dust storms, which always good to include more weather types. Here's a weird one though. Planet rotation. Playtesting has made it obvious people are struggling to adjust to this during play, so its effects have been reduced further. Now, as far as I know, in version 1.0, there really isn't planet rotation. So maybe what he means is the speed at which the time of day changes. It's really hard to tell what this means. Ship diversity. This overhauled some of the tech as well as the spawn rates for ships. Inventory. Now this is really important. So I've played 1.0 and originally you could only carry 100 of any raw material in your inventory per slot and 1 item in each inventory slot. So nowadays, as you know, a regular backpack inventory, you can carry 9,999, carbon. But back in 1.0, you could only carry 100 carbon. So your inventory filled up fast. And what they did on the day 1 patch, which is really important, is that they increased that number to 250 per inventory slot and 500 on your ship. And this is how the game was for several years. And a lot of people complain that this was too small or whatever, but oh boy, it was even worse before this patch. But I'm thankful that now we can pretty much just carry 1 slot of any given resource, because there are just so many more resources nowadays than there used to be. Alright, so trading. It says trading is deeper. They now have their own wants and needs based off galactic economy. I don't know about based off a galactic economy, but it definitely did give each system its own specific supply and demand needs. It says they've also rebalanced trading, fixed a couple exploits. Now here's a weird one, another weird one. Feeding. Creatures now have their own diet based on planet and climate. Okay, that was true. Feeding them correctly will yield different results per species, such as mining for you, protecting the player, becoming pets, alerting you to rare loot, or pooping valuable resources. Now, I didn't play too much with the fauna at the beginning of the game, or back in 2016. I do remember feeding them. I still remember you'd see them, it's oh, this one needs iron, oh, that one needs carbon, or whatever. And you would feed them and they'd get a little smiley face icon or whatever. And they would poop and it would give you something else. I don't think Fecium was a thing back then. But some of the other things it mentions here, mining for you, protecting the player, becoming pets. I don't know. I didn't see those myself. Comment below if you did, if you know of these behaviors. This sounds a lot like the Companions update from 2021, but I mean, maybe that stuff was in the game. That's the funny thing. The game was so big back then. There was a lot of stuff I missed at that time. So, survival, they rebalanced that. They updated some graphical effects. They said temporal anti-aliasing didn't make it in time, but it's so close. That's really funny. And that will come in the next update, believe me. They did lots of balancing. They reworked combat a little bit to make it better. Space combat included, fix some exploits. They say they improve stability. From what I've heard, 1.0 is actually more stable than 1.03, but That could just be the length of play session. Like here they say based on if you work further than 256 light years, then you had a chance of crashing, which is strange. Space stations. So this is the first time they regenerated space stations. So basically, if you play 1.0, they used to be pretty empty. They had the 2 rooms on the sides, right? And in one room, it had the trade terminal, and in the other room, it had a cryo chamber, which you could use to save your game. And that was pretty much it. So this day one patch actually added, as it describes, more varied bars, trade rooms, and hydroponic labs, which really cool. And I still remember back in the day wondering what was behind those doors. It was so hard to get an Atlas pass back in the day. It was a pain in the ass. It was a lot of RNG, really. So yeah, I always wondered what was behind those doors. You can now scan from your ship. They say they improved some pop-in, and they added the Atlas Pass, or rewrote the Atlas Path, which in the original 1.0, and this is, by the way, I should have said this at the beginning. This video will include spoilers for everything. Spoilers for story, spoilers for lore, because I want to cover everything that these patches include, and it often includes spoilers. So big spoiler here. The original Atlas Path really leaned into the fact that the universe was a simulation, right? And that the Atlas was a computer. And it's pretty obvious in the current Atlas Path. But it was really just leaning into that originally. And there wasn't an Atlas language either, so you would just get all of the story text immediately. With this, they made it a little bit more mysterious, and then by obscuring some of the text behind a language you had to learn, they made it even more mysterious. And they gave you some branching paths, so at the beginning you can choose to, ignore the Atlas or comply with the Atlas. You can make some choices with the Atlas stones, so you can get different quote-unquote endings. It wasn't much, but it really did help give the game a little bit more direction, especially for those people who kind of need objectives and things to work with. Alright, so that covers pretty much what this day one patch added. Now let's go to the ranking criteria. So here's the scoreboard for the day one patch. Now, as you can see, there's 8 boxes for criteria. The first 4 are based on the 4 pillars that the game advertised. You can see them in videos. PlayStation did a series of videos on them. It's in the launch trailer, as well as promotional materials, including the press kit, which I have a copy of now. So those four pillars are explore, fight, trade, and survive. And I feel like those do pretty much cover the gambit of what the game offered at launch. However, I'm going to add 4 more pillars of my own. Now, only 2 of these will be relevant on this first one. The 5th pillar, I'm adding a story, because I think that is an important part of No Man's Sky, and that would be story and lore. And then we have quality of life. That's also very important to any video game. And then we have building, which obviously doesn't exist at this time, and multiplayer, which was another huge aspect of the game. Now, some of you might be wondering, what about VR? VR is very important to the game. A lot of people play exclusively in VR. But as far as these updates are concerned, the content pretty much any content they add can be played either in VR or out of VR. So I won't be including VR as a separate pillar. Most updates don't really deal with it directly. They might have a small fix or a small thing that they include for VR, but it's not something that I think would benefit most patches to be scored on. So let's take a look at how this does. For Explore, I give it an 8.5, and you might think that's really, really high. It's pretty high, and the reason is this was the first time anyone got to play No Man's Sky, right? We all got our hands on it day one. There was a lot of excitement, and we had never seen any of the planets before. None of them. So it's not like nowadays where a patch will come out and it's the same planets, so you don't feel like you have anything new to explore. All of these planets were new, and everything we were finding, we didn't we didn't really know what was in the game, to be honest. So we were discovering systems, we were discovering story, lore, planets. So exploration was pretty abundant. Fight, I give it a 4. And bear in mind, that might sound really low, but the scale I'm going by, 0 to 10, a 5 is average, right? So if it works, it's fine, or it's decent, that's like a 4 or a 5. A 7 is actually quite good, and a 10 is really good. So when I give this a 4, I just mean like the fighting mechanics were somewhat subpar. Like, yeah, you could shoot a gun, but it was a lot more like Fallout, you know what I mean? Which you couldn't aim down sights. The combat was really basic. The weapons they had at launch, you have to bear in mind, they had a bolt caster, and they had a plasma, I guess, grenade. And that was pretty much it. And you had your mining beam. So that was it. No weapon variety. No real enemy variety. You had the 3 sentinel types and the planetary fauna. And then in space, you had your phase beams and you had your basic blasters, right? And back in the day, the way combat was balanced, your shields would go down really fast. And in order to recharge them, you didn't have a quick menu. You would have to open up your actual inventory screen and manually recharge your shields with materials. And you would have to do that several times within a single battle. And that was a pain in the ass. I know some people appreciate that kind of like, managing your ship in battle, but considering the game had a very streamlined arcade feel to it as far as weapon selection and controls and all that, having such a cumbersome feature didn't feel like you were doing engineering. It felt more like pain in the ass, honestly. So subpar, 4 out of 10. For trade, even 5, right? This is the starting trading for the game. There's a decent amount of resources, different trade items available in different systems. There was basic supply and demand. Some items would have like a star next to them if they're really lucrative in that system. It worked. 5 out of 10. Survive, I give it a 6 out of 10 because I know a lot of people don't appreciate the survival mechanics in No Man's Sky, and I'm not saying they're great. But, granted, it did add some difficulty to the game. A lot of people didn't necessarily know it was a survival game going in. And I just remember it was actually a challenge in this early game because of the limited amount of resources you could carry on you. You were constantly getting stranded, having to refuel your ship. And in order to find those resources, you would be, trekking across hostile environments. It was a pretty satisfying survival loop, I have to say. But it wasn't anything special. So, 6 out of 10. Now, story and lore, I also give this a 5. I love the lore in No Man's Sky. I think this update did a really good job of sort of setting the tone. But there wasn't much to it, right? There was a little bit of lore about the races, but it really left us with a lot of questions. And I know for some people that's really great. But even like the main storyline, right? Unless you knew the Atlas words, you really didn't know what the Atlas was saying to you a lot of the time. So it was really hard to get an idea of what the story meant, what your place in the universe was, or why anything was the way it was. But it was still very intriguing. It really fit the tone of the release game of loneliness and solitude. So I'll give it a base 5. And quality of life, I'm actually giving this a 4. And the reason is, a 5 is like, it works, right? It's not great. It's not innovative necessarily, but it works. Now, I give it 1 point less than that because oftentimes it didn't work. This game crashed a lot. It had a lot of bugs with, parking your ship in strange places, it getting stuck in terrain, you getting stuck in terrain being inside buildings, just all kinds of kooky bugs. Not to mention, the interface wasn't great. A lot of the things we take for granted nowadays didn't exist. You had to manually upload every single discovery you made, one by one, which doesn't sound that bad, but it was a chore back in the day. And even navigating to if you would go to a trade terminal, right? If you wanted to buy something, you'd click on the buy screen. And then if you wanted to sell something, instead of pressing a button to toggle, you would go back a level in the menu and then click the sell, and then go back into the store. And it was stuff like that. Like every time you walked into a building, there'd be like a little cutscene where like the alien inside would acknowledge you. And that sounds cool, but literally every building you walked into, it would do this cutscene. and there were, I could mention 100 other strange design choices, but it worked for the most part. But it was below average, I would say. So 4 out of 10. And of course, building in multiplayer, not applicable. I know what some of you were thinking. You were expecting multiplayer at launch. We're not going to get into that discussion. Listen, there were no screenshots of multiplayer. There was no gameplay of multiplayer. They did not say, this is a multiplayer game. The box did not say network, 1 to 10 players or anything like that. I know some of you will take something Sean Murray said and say, oh, that meant multiplayer. But, I don't know. Like I said, they didn't show us any gameplay. So it's really hard to consider it a multiplayer game if it was only advertised as single player. So I won't include that here, but that will come into play pretty soon. So overall, if you average all this out, I'm gonna round to the nearest decimal number, but you can see the full number on screen now. It's a 5.5, which not bad, slightly better than average, and that, because we only have one thing on the scoreboard, is number 1 in the rankings right now. Easy peasy. For me, I would give it a higher score. I would probably say it was like a 8, but I was totally a fanboy, and I was really excited, and I was so giddy when I took off from my first planet. So honestly, that's why these are separate rankings. So right now it's also at the top of my personal rankings. But that will probably change with this next one. Now we move on to our first titled update, the Foundation Update. Version 1.1, released November 26, 2016. Now this is a juggernaut of an update. Notable features include resetting the universe again, as was quite common in this era. They added base building and farming, huge. And they also added ownable freighters, so you can now land on freighters and interact with those. In addition to new game modes, and a UI overhaul, and the famous quick menu. Alright, so let's dive into the patch notes. Now, this is also where they began using this beautiful artwork that you see on screen. So I'm just going to read through the major points. Hopefully this won't take too long because they added a lot. So the first thing is they added game modes. You got your normal mode, you have your creative mode, which now you can like build with unlimited resources essentially, and things can't really hurt you. And then you have survival mode, which is pretty much like a harder version of normal mode. They also added death quotes, which very video gamey, very nice. Base building. I won't go into detail about base building, but back then, well, yeah, watch as I proceed to go into detail. Back then you had to find a base site. So originally you couldn't build anywhere. You would have to find these predetermined locations, and they would be like these flat pieces of land. And in the middle would be a small prefab building with a teleporter and a base computer built into the wall. And what you would do is you would claim that base, and you could only have one base. You would claim that base, and then you could build with a limited number of prefab parts onto that central building. And you could hire NPCs, that's another thing they added here. And you could farm. So all of the basics for base building were really established in this update. And some people at the time said, oh, it doesn't really change the game, it just adds more stuff to do. I felt like it really changed the game. Having a place to go back to, having sort of like in a universe that felt like it was constantly changing. It was like, this is your little slice where you can stop, you know what I mean? Because you're constantly warping in the old days where you couldn't really set up a base anywhere you liked. So in order to make farming a thing, they needed to add new plants to the game. And this manifested in the system that we still see to this day, which is specific plants on specific biome and planet types. And this was really cool, right? Because before you would kind of see the same resources on every planet, more or less. I mean, obviously some planets would have gold, some would have emerald, but really it wasn't specific to any biome, right? It was mostly a visual thing. Well, now there were specific resources that you needed to visit specific biomes to collect, and it added, I mean, I can't tell you how much of a game changer this felt like at the time. Nowadays it seems like a minor thing, but every change that they make to that sort of system, right, that changes why you go to each biome, actually has a huge impact on the game. Building also included now portable things, so you could deploy automated harvesters, you could build, I think this is where they added signal scanners that you could build, save points, which again, that might not seem like a big deal, but you couldn't call your ship at this time. So if you had been exploring on a planet's surface for like 20 minutes and you were 20 minutes away from your ship, you couldn't call it. So what you could do is you could deploy one of these save points and just save your game there, which nowadays they're kind of depreciated. I haven't really used one in years, but at the time they were a lifesaver. Now, a big feature, and maybe my favorite feature of this update, was that they made freighters interactive. You could finally dock at a freighter, and it was, oh my gosh, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but at the time, just a new interior to explore, because obviously we had unlimited exterior space, right? All the planets you could ever dream of. But as far as interior spaces, you had the Atlas stations, which all looked the same. You had the Anomaly, which always looked the same. Space stations, which pretty much always looked the same. And then the inside of buildings, which looked very much the same also. Now, obviously, they didn't add like 100 different freighter interiors. They still haven't. But just having one more interior space to explore just made the game universe feel that much bigger. Surprisingly, it's really weird. And then, of course, the gameplay coming with it. You could own a freighter, build a base on one. It added new trade opportunities, so you didn't always have to go to a space station. You could now, have ships dock and trade with them on a freighter, which was really cool. It was also extra storage, which at this point was really, really important. Any extra storage slots you could get were lifesavers. So, they also added new resources and technology. A lot of the tech we see nowadays, microprocessors and stuff, that was added in this update. And some of it was specific, like the Hazmat Gauntlet, so you could access the new stuff. And some of it was locked behind the base building missions. And this just sort of encouraged you to interact with the new systems. And to that end, I really enjoyed the base building missions. But I'll get into that later. Because right now, we're talking about user interface improvements. And I can't talk about user interface improvements without mentioning the quick menu, which is possibly the smartest improvement they ever made. And thank goodness for this, because the game really was quite tedious and cumbersome in a lot of ways to manage recharging things, because as you know, you have to recharge technology quite often. And nowadays it's a lot easier, and you don't recharge it as often because you have so many efficiency upgrades. But back in the day, you were recharging stuff very often. So having to go into your inventory every 3 minutes was really a pain in the butt, especially for space combat. So this improved space combat a little bit in that way, but it improved just overall gameplay. And another big deal was they added the ability to stack items. And what I mean by that is, say you have a carite sheet and you have a recipe that requires 5 carite sheets. Well, in order to do that, you needed 5 slots, inventory slots, to store one for each carite sheet, and then a 6th slot where you craft the item, which when inventory is limited, that is very difficult to pull off. So now you could just, with the Foundation update, you could just have 5 carite sheets in a stack in one slot, and then a 2nd slot to craft the item. Easy peasy, right? Huge improvement. And they made other improvements to icons and UI areas, and that's all good and well, but the one I want to highlight is the danger indicator. I don't know why I laughed. I made a joke in my head, but in your starship cockpit, For fighters, it's on the left. I'm not sure where it falls necessarily for haulers or other ships, but you have a little circle. And in case you didn't know this, that little circle appears before you're going to have a space encounter, specifically a combat encounter. So if you're going to be scanned by pirates, this little circle will start counting down. It'll get smaller and smaller. And when it disappears, that means you're going to be scanned. So before this, you had no idea. You would always be blindsided, and it was always a pain in the butt. With this, you could plan a little bit, right? Say you see it appearing, and you're near a space station. You fly in, and their scan fails, and then you fly out, and you're good to go. Or you're in the middle of a pulse, right, and you see it appear. You can call your freighter, go into it as it fails, and then come back out and continue, if you wanted to avoid fights. So it really added a little bit of strategy to the game. And the last patch note I want to cover for Foundation, again, if you want to check out the full patch notes, links in the description. It's really interesting to read, but it will take you a while because they added a lot. But the last thing I want to cover is the temporal anti-aliasing, which Sean said he was so close to finishing for day 1, but didn't make it in. But here it is, and it came with motion blur. So that helped improve the way the game looked. Very nice. And now let's see how this is going to score. So for exploration, I give it a 9. You might say, why? Well, I didn't cover it in great detail because they didn't highlight it in the notes, but they did regenerate the universe again. And they changed a lot of things about it. So they changed the terrain, they added more flat areas for base building and other purposes. They messed with the cloud tech. They added more variation in buildings. So now you had planets without buildings and planets with more buildings. Back in the day, every planet had the same amount of buildings, right? So you would go to a dead planet and it would have just as many buildings as a fertile world. Didn't make any sense, but I'm glad they added a little bit of variety to that, as well as tweaking color and a lot of other things. So that obviously is one part of exploration. But then the other part is that with the new base building requirements of finding unique resources in different biomes, you are encouraged to visit every biome again, which also enhances exploration, in my opinion. Having to explore these landscapes, looking for, because back then, nowadays we have like these huge groves of stuff, so you can see a huge grove of frostwort from your ship. But back in the day, they were just little plants, kind of like the zinc plants. Pretty much what you see in your planter, that's what you would find on planets. So you would have to land and just walk around trying to find these resources. So I feel like that really encouraged exploration. And then on top of that, we also now have ownable freighters, which means you have one more reason to warp from system to system looking for unique variations. Not just as far as slots go, but, just overall design. So for all those reasons, I gave it a 9 for exploration, because I felt like it gave me a lot of things to look at the time, when I had felt like I had kind of seen all that I could see by that point. For fight, I give it a 2. It didn't really add anything to combat, but the quick menu did make it slightly easier to fight in your ship. So I give it a 2. Trade, I give a 7, above average, because it added a ton of new resources, a ton of new components you could craft and sell, as well as farming just added a new dimension to trade, right? Because you could actually produce things in your home system and then take them to another system where they were needed. Or you could craft new recipes from those that would, be more profitable. So it really added like a whole new way to make money. Survive, I give a 5, because obviously they're always making tweaks to the mechanics, but they didn't really add any new survival mechanics per se. Farming isn't really necessary for survival, and neither are freighters or anything, but they did add survival mode, so I gotta give them credit for that. 5 out of 10. Story, I give a 7, and I know that seems really high, but I really enjoyed the base building missions. If you haven't done those yet, I believe they're still pretty similar today. You should give them a try. Each NPC actually is their own character. They have their own backstories and personalities, and I found it really engaging myself. And then quality of life, I give it an 8 out of 10 for the quick menu alone, but also just the other changes I mentioned to inventory, as well as, icon, UI, and all that. So really impressive improvements to quality of life, including, graphical upgrades. And then building, obviously, 9 out of 10. You might say, why not 10 out of 10? Building was still quite limited. You could still only build in certain places. You can only have one base. You couldn't share your base with others, even if they found your system. It was very good. Very, very good. But not perfect. And I know later I'm going to give something a 10 out of 10. You're going to say, that's not perfect. Yeah, I know. 9 out of 10 is good. It's okay. And multiplayer, not applicable. So that averages out to about 6.6. Which, if we look at our rankings over here, we can see that is in fact better than the Day 1 patch. So that moves to the top of the rankings. Day 1 patch is now number 2. And for my personal rankings, I also put this above the Day 1 patch because I was in love with freighters. I felt like it really helped complete that space fantasy. So this is also number 1. And as for my personal rating for this, I would give it a 9 out of 10 because I loved it. But that's very subjective. So, alright, let's move on to the next update. Alright, well that was the inaugural year of No Man's Sky. But now we're moving on to 2017, which was another big year for the game. So at this point, it still hadn't been quote-unquote redeemed in a lot of people's eyes. So these first few updates were kind of under the radar, right? They would get some press, but people really didn't change their tune. Which is a real shame because this next update is one that a lot of people consider their favorite update. It's not my favorite update, but it is quite good. And that is the Pathfinder update, version 1.2, released March 8th, 2017. Oh boy, so notable features include a visual overhaul and photo mode, which is invaluable to people nowadays. It added Exocraft and the Exocraft NPC, Starship, and multi-tool specializations, which are a really big deal to me, and tons of other new content, which I will cover in a minute. So, let's see what the patch notes have to say on this one. First of all, they want to show off their visual updates. So I love No Man's Sky at launch. I love the visual design of it, the stylization, and this is going to piss some people off, but I gotta be honest, it did not always look good in the moment-to-moment gameplay. Like, if the lighting wasn't just right, it often looked like, I don't know what it looked like, just a bunch of polygons. And here's a couple screenshots, right, of it just like, I don't know what's going on. And and I love the game at launch, but it could have looked better. And Pathfinder really did improve it. It took it from what I thought. Oh, what the? Really? Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. They were doing some leaf blowing outside. Anyway, so yeah, the game looks a lot better with Pathfinder. I don't know if it'd be controversial, but one thing they did was they removed the yellow filter. And a lot of people love the yellow filter, right? They thought it made everything look really stylized, and it did, right? But it also made everything look kind of yellow. So there's a lot more variety of atmospherics and color and skies and stuff in Pathfinder, and I actually appreciated the change in lighting. Another cool thing they added, and this was, I think it was just for PC. No, actually they did do it for PlayStation, but it was really difficult. So they added base sharing. And with base sharing on PC, I think there was like some kind of Steam interface where you could like share your creations. But for PS4 players, you needed to literally find the system that had the base, which portals didn't work back then. They were just aesthetic. So finding someone's base was really difficult, and you needed third-party tools, and it was a pain in the butt. But they added a trophy for it, so presumably it was possible. They also, another big thing they did was add the ability to own multiple ships. Really cool. It was really hard to decide. This is why I don't have my original ship, right? Because I was always trying to upgrade back in the day, and you could only have one ship, so of course you wouldn't keep your original one. But then what they did, and this is what I love most about Pathfinder, is they did starship and multi-tool customizations and classes. So at launch, ships were just ships, right? And you could kind of tell they had some differences, but the game didn't explicitly state what the difference between a fighter or an explorer was. And so those weren't actually given distinctions until Pathfinder. So now they have, different stats. Fighters were better at maneuvering and better at combat. Explorers had better range, and haulers had better cargo capacity. And on top of that, they added class systems. So you had A, B, and C class, and then the coveted S class, which had even better stats. And this was really cool because it gave you, again, one more thing to try and collect and improve. And it gave you another reason to keep exploring. And this also transferred over to multi-tools. So now there was a distinction between pistols, rifles, experimental, and alien multi-tools, which I think it's a little bit harder to see in the game nowadays. It's not as obvious as it used to be. On top of that, they released new weapons. So this was pretty cool. They added the scatter blaster, the pulse spitter, and the blaze javelin to your multi-tool. And then for ship combat, they added the cyclotron ballista, positron ejector, and the infraknife accelerator, along with some upgrades for those, I believe. But yeah, that was really cool. I remember because back then you also had to unlock these things a little bit differently. Actually, to that effect, that's one more thing they added, was they added a new vendor that would appear at your base as well as in space stations, and that's where you would buy your blueprints from, right? The blueprint vendor. So that was really cool. It was like I think that was the very first step they took to adding vendors to space stations and stuff like that. And I remember just thinking it was the coolest thing because it had like this little hologram. I mean, they still have it over the weapon vendor, that little scrolling display. But at the time, I just thought it was the bee's knees. So, a big marquee feature of this update was obviously Exocraft. It was they're planetary vehicles you can use to explore the surface without getting in your ship. And this was really useful, again, for collecting those biome-specific resources where you couldn't really see them from your ship. And if you're just walking around, you were really vulnerable to the elements, and it would take a long time to get anywhere or get back to your ship. So Exocraft allowed you to explore for great distances and a longer amount of time away from your ship. So they were pretty useful back in the day. Nowadays, I pretty much just use them for fun, right? I think they're a lot of fun to drive around. So they added the Nomad, which was like a hovercraft. It could hover over water. The Roamer, which was a all-purpose car. And then the Colossus, which had the most storage, but it was kind of slow. It was huge. Fun fact, I actually, back in the day, used the Roamer as like a submarine. So it functioned more like a diving bell because it moved very slowly underwater. So what I would do is I would use it to move along the ocean surface and then go out and explore the ocean and then go back in to replenish my air supply. Because believe it or not, oceans used to be, or maybe it was the way you move, but they used to be deep enough that reaching the surface from the bottom was very difficult. So it would make sense to have an air supply at the bottom. And funny enough, it was really difficult to explore oceans. In fact, there was often a portion of the ocean, I don't remember if this was Pathfinder or Atlas Rises, sorry for the tangent, but like you would reach a certain point in the ocean where there really wouldn't be any plants anymore. It was just kind of like blank, like a certain distance from shore. So it was a completely different thing back then. It's really spooky. But that was like an alternate use for the Roamer. So with this, they added Exocraft races, which are still in the game and a lot of fun to do. This is the update where they added nanite clusters, which is a big deal, a second form of currency. All kinds of new base building blueprints. They also made it more obvious what your standing was with the different races. And they added, well, here it says photo mode. So this is, I think photo mode was mentioned in Foundation's patch notes, but honestly they added it here in Pathfinder. And even in my own screenshots, you can see the difference between, pre-photo mode and post-photo mode. So I really love this addition. I think it gave me a new way of documenting things, because I always try and take a screenshot on any planet I land on, but with photo mode I could really capture it. Let's see, a couple hours of new music, lots of quality of life. You can now rename your ship and skip the black bars whenever you had a milestone, which is really big. Oh yeah, the last thing I want to cover is they added permadeath mode, which, if you don't know, if you die, it deletes your save file. So you only get one shot to make it to the end. And with this update also came, I think, 3 new trophies, which was really cool. And I kind of wish they kept adding trophies with each update, but then I guess it'd be kind of impossible to 100% it for a casual player. But anyways, so that's Pathfinder, right? Lots of great stuff in that one. Let's move on over to the scoreboard. Boop. So for Explore, now I'm going to catch a lot of flack for this, but I'm giving it a 5. And you might say, whoa, Gennady, they regenerated the universe again. Every planet is now new to explore. Yeah, but they didn't really add anything to explore, though. They just changed things. They changed some of the grass, but it was pretty much the same creatures, the same trees, the same biomes. It wasn't that big of a difference, in my opinion. I mean, I still enjoyed exploring, but I think this universe reset was mostly due to improve fidelity versus actual changes to, or major changes to, planet generation. So that's why I give it a 5. For fight, I give it a 7 because they added a ton of new weapons. Now, they didn't really add many new things to do with the weapons, right? Not like all new threats or anything, but they added lots of new weapons, which made combat a lot more interesting. For trade, I give it a 9. Now, this might seem really high, so let me explain this. So it added new currency, right? And it added a new vendor, which really big deals back in the day. When you have 0 vendors, adding 1 vendor is a big deal. And adding a new currency, like pretty much doubling the amount of currencies. In addition to that, now that you have like different classes of vehicles and multi-tools, you have a lot more reasons to upgrade and trade and purchase more. And I mean, in a sense, I guess, stimulate the economy, so to speak. I just feel like it really improved the buying aspect of the game and the trading aspect, literal trading in things. So that was really cool. Survive, I give a 6. Permadeath is obviously a very difficult survival. So for players interested in that is a really cool addition to the game. And I put it, slightly above average for that reason. Story, I'm giving that, let me see what I put here. A 3. Now, I know I didn't really mention a story, but with the addition of exocrafts, they added a new NPC that you could hire at your base, which was the exocraft guy. And I really enjoyed this Viking storyline. I like the mission structure because, they had you racing towards certain objectives. They're talking about, you get more insight into Viking culture, and you genuinely feel for the guy, or non-binary Viking creature. So I really enjoyed that story, but it wasn't very much, which is why it gets a 3. Quality of life, 10 out of 10. Honestly, from the graphics to the performance to photo mode, to naming your ship, to the ABC S-Class, to the ship specializations, new blueprints, all of that contributes to quality of life. And the game was so much different. after this update, I have to give it 10 out of 10. Building, I also give an 8 out of 10 because they added tons of new parts, new materials, new way to upgrade your buildings, and then they made them shareable, right? So now you have a guest book, and people could visit your base and write their name in your guest book. So you would log on and say, oh wow, someone visited. That was really cool. So that's an 8 out of 10. And multiplayer, still not applicable. I know you can visit other people's bases, but still not applicable. So that averaged out to about a 6.8. Which, if we go over to our rankings here, that puts it right on top. So the new rankings are Pathfinder, Foundation, and then the Day 1 patch. Now, personally, I give this update an 8.75 or so. Right? Personally, I really love this update, but for me, Foundation was just so much more significant for where the game was at the time and where I was as a player. So my personal rankings, subjective, remember, are number 1 Foundations, number 2 Pathfinder, and then number 3 the Day 1 patch. So, wow, this has actually taken a lot more time than I would have expected. But I am going to go ahead and cover Atlas Rises before closing out this first video. Alright, so we finally made it to my favorite update of this era, which is Atlas Rises version 1.3, released August 11th, 2017. So this was the 1-year anniversary of No Man's Sky. And this update is notable for so many reasons. Not the least of which was that it added the first version of multiplayer to the game, which a lot of news outlets and a lot of influencers and people tend to credit next with adding multiplayer. And that makes sense because that was like fully synchronous multiplayer. But the first time you could see other players and interact with them in game was actually a year prior to that, in this update, Atlas Rises. So notable features also include another universe reset, because obviously. But this time, unlike Pathfinder, this added completely new biomes, completely new assets to planet generation. Some really interesting stuff. It added 30 plus hours of story. And let me tell you, that's not just a bullet point. It really added a lot of content to the game. New points of interest, holy cow. The actual buildings you came across on planets in the first year didn't really change. You added bases that you could obviously own, but other than that, it was the same points of interest. So this added new ones. It added mission boards, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but trust me, a lot of times back in the day, you're wondering, well, what do I do with my time? You know what I mean? This actually gave you little things to work on, which also added a lot to the experience. And like a million other things, honestly. So let me get to the patch notes before I bore you to death. Alright. So, the first thing they cover is a new story. Now, for those of you who play today, this is the Artemis storyline. And, oh my gosh, it is hard to overstate how big of a difference Atlas Rises made. Because of this new storyline, we had new characters with unique character models, right? You have Artemis, you have Apollo, you have Noel, which, funny enough, I don't know if you knew this, but they're kind of like caricatures of the different players at the time. I might do a separate video on that later, but that's a whole nother thing. But it added the new Traveler race, right? So now it added a 4th race to the universe that you could find at space stations and in trading posts. It added all of this new stuff. It added a new interface to ships, right? So that you could actually interact with people in your ship, which had so many gameplay repercussions. The story also meant they added holoterminuses, which were new points of interest to the game, which these were like the tallest structures we had ever seen at that point in the game, I believe. And it was incredible. I actually really enjoyed the story. It's a branching narrative. You can make different choices that lead to different outcomes. I've been meaning to replay it, but if you've just been exploring and you haven't gotten around to it, I suggest you do. It's really cool. And especially, I guess there's a little bit of a spoiler, but the storyline is about kind of like connecting as travelers, and at the time it was really pertinent because as a community we had all been playing separately, and now this update was allowing us to meet each other for the first time. And the storyline kind of follows that same theme. You know, you're trying to unite with a lost traveler for the first time. So I thought it was really poignant, and I really enjoyed it. Okay, so for galactic regeneration, let me just tell you, this is, again, a lot of people consider Next to be the beginning of quote-unquote the new art style, but I firmly believe Atlas Rises was the actual turning point, because they added multiple new biomes. This is where they started to add like bespoke biomes where there was less variation, but they were more distinct from other biomes. So this is where the exotics were added, right? This is where you would find those big hexagon planets, or the ones with those spinning machines. This is where bubble worlds were added. All of that stuff came in Atlas Rises. And it was so exciting. Just seeing the screenshot of the hexagon planet that they had in the patch notes. The idea that like there were suddenly strange new worlds I'd never seen before. And with these, they also brought another new point of interest, which were the giant, they're called something else, but I always just call them like big ring structures. And these added even more lore to the game, and it was something that we had always wanted because it was in the 2014 pre-release trailer. But now we could finally see them for ourselves. You could fly through them in a ship. It was so cool. But in addition to that, the other reason I say that this is where the art style began to change is on Frozen Worlds, they added these new evergreen trees, and it was like almost like a distinct subtype of the Frozen biome. Less variation, right? They pretty much all looked pretty similar. But the trees were a lot more realistic, a lot more high fidelity. They had more detail. And the same went for a new desert biome that they added that had, you know, more detailed plants, but less variety among those plants. Another thing they added, which, holy cow, this was a big deal to me too, as you can probably tell. Everything was a big deal to me back then. But crashed freighters, another thing we had seen in the 2014 gameplay trailer, was finally in the game. And these were the biggest points of interest on planets. And again, they gave us something more to explore. They had lore, they had stuff you could dig up. And speaking of digging up, they added a terrain manipulator, which is an essential part of the game nowadays. But back then it was brand new, and it was super cool. They added the mission board, the mission system, which, again, really great, being able to earn rewards and actually go on missions outside of the Atlas line. Because before, the Atlas path was the only direction you had in the game. Now you could undertake missions for different guilds, which, again, they introduced guilds. How cool is that? That you could build your standing with and unlock stuff, including new missions. All new trading. They added a ton of new resources and materials to trade. New trade goods. I think they added gas in this update. So now you could use gas harvesters to get stuff from the atmosphere. All kinds of new recipes and stuff. They redid the analysis visor. Pretty much the entire user interface was overhauled to a certain extent. Visual improvements, holy cow. Pathfinder was a huge step up from Foundations, and Atlas Rises was a huge step up in fidelity as well. Very pretty game at this point. Always was, but even prettier now. And geez, okay, and the hits don't stop with this update. They updated, or they finally activated portals, which again had been shown in trailers, or actually in the game at launch, but just completely inactive. You couldn't do anything with them. Now you could actually use them to travel anywhere in the galaxy. And you could share coordinates with friends, they could visit your base. We could finally start establishing real communities. And it was beautiful. So cool. And then space combat updated. You could do low flight now, so you could have more intense battles on the planet's surface. And of course, here we have joint exploration, which is what they called the first version of multiplayer, where you pretty much just appeared as little floating orbs, but if you met another player and you were the first people to meet in that system, you could form a monument. And I think those still exist to this day. And those monuments would commemorate the 2 users who met, because it was such a big deal back then. It was beautiful. And then they couldn't help themselves. They also added a new ship type, which was the exotic ship. And this included the really, really cool but not very diverse squid ships, which are still the rarest type of ship in the game to this day. I mean, I've seen them at the Nexus, but I've never come across one in my own game in 5 years of playing. And then they also added the other royal type ship, which has a lot more variation and was a really cool addition. I mean, just trying to find these in game, they always felt like collector's items. Again, quality of life, they added Fahrenheit for us Americans. You could now summon your ship, which, again, game changer. This is where they separated inventory, so now you can have general, tech, and cargo, which another game changer, obviously. And just a bunch of good stuff. The patch notes are so long, I encourage you to read them yourself if you're interested. Link in the description below. But let me go straight to the grades, right? So, for exploration, 9.5. Almost perfect. They added so much new stuff to the game. New biomes to explore, new points of interest, new story, now with portals, you could just put in random coordinates and visit new places. It was so cool. Exploration was significantly enhanced, but the new biomes, once you had seen it once, it was kind of the same on every planet with that same biome, right? With the exotics. So that detracts a little bit, but still 9.5, amazing. Fight, I gave a 6. They did do some improvements to space combat and on-foot combat. Minor stuff. Now, this is why I need to bring up an important point. The spreadsheet I'm basing this off, I've been updating it for years. So, at the time when I scored this, I had done my research, I had read every patch note, and I had compared it with my own experience and come to these conclusions. I'm not entirely sure why I gave this a 6, but I trust my past self to have done the research. So before you start commenting, I didn't give a good reason. I know, but I trust my former self. I hope you do too. Trade gets a 10. Not only did they add a whole bunch of new materials and trade goods, they added new really high-end recipes that required, several steps. And this is really where people started building those big farms where they would create all the materials needed for a really complicated recipe and become billionaires and all that. A lot of that was in Atlas Rises. In addition to now you could visit certain systems with portal coordinates and find precisely what you needed. They had, exotic ships to buy. And I'm sure I had another reason, again, going back to when I rated this, but I think a 10 is pretty good because it really changed a lot of stuff. For Survive, I gave it a 1. For as much as they added in this update, they didn't really add anything that affects survival mechanics, if I'm being honest. So that's a 1, which is really strange. Story, 10 out of 10, obviously. Quality of life, that's going to be another 10 out of 10, obviously. For building, I gave it a 3, right? There were a few new things added, but it wasn't much. But the cool thing is, and this is indirect, doesn't affect that score, but you can now visit other people's bases with people, so you could give them a tour, so that's kind of fun. And then multiplayer finally comes into the fold with a 6. I know what you're thinking, how is that above average? You couldn't even it wasn't synchronous? No, but it was badass for the time. They took a single player game, and instead of creating a separate mode, they added ambient multiplayer to an infinite universe. And it just worked, right? I would go through a portal, the old bird portal, and land on a planet, and there would just be someone there, right? And you could leave comm balls to leave messages for people. You could create monuments, visit bases, guest books. And people were able to build a community in this formerly single-player game, in this infinite universe, near infinite, People found each other, and people established bases with the portals, and they built communities. So that's why I give it a 6, because as limited as it was, people were able to do some really incredible things with it, and it was such a leap forward from where it was at launch. So you average all that together and we end up at about 6.9, which I know that seems really low, especially considering like I'm so high on Atlas Rises. I guess part of that is the survive. I only gave it a 1. Now, bear in mind, again, these scores are meant to be somewhat objective, I am planning to do a tier list video at some point once I've completed all of these, and that will be much more into the hype of it. So like this, yeah, it gets a 6.9 based on this scale, but in my tier video, it would probably be S class or S tier, you know what I mean? Because it's phenomenal and it changed everything. So try not to be too upset about the scores that my criteria give it. Obviously, you can tell by the amount of time I spent talking about these that I love all of these updates, and I think they're way better than my own scoring gives them credit for. And to that end, I would personally give this a score of 10 out of 10. Perfect update, adds a shit ton of stuff. Yeah, I love it. So let's go to the rankings. And funny enough, you can see a consistent rise in quality here, with Atlas Rises at number 1, Pathfinder at number 2, Foundation number 3, and the Day 1 patch at number 4. And similarly, my rankings are just a little bit different, with Atlas Rises number 1, Foundation number 2, Pathfinder number 3, and the Day 1 patch at number 4. So that will conclude the first in a series of videos ranking and reviewing all of the No Man's Sky title updates. I really hope you enjoyed it. I know it might run a little long, and I'm still figuring out the format myself, but thank you so much for watching it. If you made it this far, congratulations. Thanks for supporting me. I hope you enjoyed the content. I'm trying to create some really substantial content, and it takes a lot of time, and I'm figuring out how to edit videos better and better. But let me know in the comments below what you thought. I'm sure at least half of you will disagree with pretty much everything I said. Let me know what your favorite was, or how you would rank these 4 updates. I would love to see some hot takes down in the comments, because a lot of Day 1 players have some pretty strong opinions about these separate updates. I won't even get into the controversy, although maybe I should. No, there's no time. So let me know in the comments below, but also let me know what you thought of the video format. You know, what would you change? Did I talk too much? Should I just do like 5 bullet points per update? Do you like me talking about all the context and my experience with it? I'm not changing. I know I just asked for feedback. I'm not changing the criteria. That is pretty well set. Again, I have a spreadsheet that I've built over the years that uses this criteria. But yeah, let me know if there's something else about this you might like better. So hopefully for the next video, which will probably cover next Abyss and Visions, let me know what you'd like to see. Alright, well, thanks again so much for watching and supporting this video. Subscribing always helps. I'm a really small channel, just getting started, and I want to make a whole bunch more content like this, you know, long form, really detailed, talking about No Man's Sky. Hopefully it's informational as well as entertaining. But yeah, leaving a like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Huge. Anyways, this video has gone on long enough. I look forward to sharing more in the next video. And y'all have a great day. See ya.